Welcome to the third installment of the Black and Green podcast. It is February 21st. I am your host, for better or for worse, Kevin Tucker. And so first things first, Gathered Remains, my new book of essays, is finally here. And at some point, I'll have a soundboard, hopefully, that I can get awesome sound effects going to give a little applause. But for the time being, you'll have to just imagine that it's there or try and hear it over yourself clapping, as I'm sure you are. Uh, this book is essays of mine that I've written over the past couple of years. It's a dense book, 344 pages, and I categorized it the other day as ethnohistory, which is anthropology, history, and of course sociology, ecology, all kinds of things that you could label it as, and I tend to not focus too much on that stuff. So it is available, blackandgreenreview.org. You can order it off there. There is also a PDF version for people who primarily, hopefully, just the people who are international and don't want to pay the exorbitant shipping fees. And that's a bit of a problem. Active distribution in the UK, should have copies over there, hopefully very near future. And always looking for other distributors so we can get physical copies of books into hands instead of just, transferring it onto a screen. Not a fan of ebooks, not a fan of reading things on screens for a lot of reasons. But if you can get the actual book, I think you'll see it's a better experience. I did actually try to go through and do the Kindle thing and all that shit, and it was a fucking mess. So, in the meantime, the PDF is on blackandgreenreview.org. You can buy it on there, and it's on Amazon. But anybody who's dealt with Amazon can tell you it kind of sucks to deal with. So I'd rather deal with actual distribution, distros, and just selling direct instead of feeding into the behemoth. The first podcast, I went over the contents a little bit, so I'm not going to go over all that again, other than to say it should be, hopefully if you're listening to this, it should be of interest, and I hope you'll pick it up. I will read a bit of the introduction. I do have the entire intro, short, acknowledgments and things like that on the website, but so this is the introduction, to give you a little sense about where it is and where it's coming from. Each of us was born wild. You, me, your friends, and your enemies, every one of us. If you're reading this book, you've been subjected to the process of domestication, the process that turns each of us, born to take part in wild nomadic communities of hunter-gatherers, and breaks us into our roles as consumers, workers, and conscripts, fodder for the world of civilization. Here, we are captives. Captives saturated with a sense of entitlement to the specifics of our cage-free ranges. We yearn for wholeness. We settle for installments. Some by choice, some by force, always by design. We are sold a sense of individuality to prove that we are unique, special. As though being defined by our choices as a consumer gives us freedom. As if allegiance to abstract constructs and ideologies gives us community. Our world, the world catered by programmers and domesticators, politicians, priests, and bosses, is built upon tearing apart our needs as social animals, community, sustenance, grounding, and selling their supplementary forms back piecemeal. We are meant to buy it and to perpetually come back for more. For the most part, we do. Because within each of us is that want, that sense of loss, our need for a sense of place, in an ecological or psychological sense, pulses beneath the surface. The reality that civilization has created threatens all life on this planet. It has taken life that will not come back. Everyday lives are on the brink of not coming back. It has created waste that, for all intents and purposes, won't go away. Yet for whatever reason, we are still here. Captives and sedate though we may be, there's a piece of us that knows something is wrong, something huge is missing, something worse is unfolding. Most likely that feeling is why you're holding this book now. Or it could be. I can relate. That feeling is what got me started down this path. That feeling is a burning rage, a refusal to accept a life of passive captivity. It is a surge of life resisting the world-eating growth of an increasingly mechanical apparatus. It reminds us that we are still alive, and it keeps us tied to the worlds that we never forget. Sedate, broken, wounded, if you're still breathing, at least a part of your wild self hasn't stopped fighting yet. It is that part that I am speaking to. That is my target audience. The arguments, the research, the endless digging, all of that is to explain that aching burn in our guts to our brains. It's hard to listen to because we've been taught to ignore it. Since birth, we are trained to see the world as a dead place. We deny our instincts, our gut reactions, even most of our senses. We silence ourselves. We become complacent. We become complicit. The more we understand about that process, where it comes from, what its costs are, the better our odds are at breaking it. To undomesticate, to rewild, to tear apart the cracks in the veneer of domestication and to embrace the wild. Suppressed, enslaved, and under assault though we may be, these wild communities are still there, struggling, resisting, existing. Domestication has never been a choice. We were born into it by chance. When we recognize what has been done and what is being done to this world, when we stop seeing ourselves as separate from it, then we will say the same about resistance. That's the beginning of the introduction. So hopefully, if you're listening, that sounds interesting to you and worth checking out. So this time there's a couple things I'm going to cover here, and hopefully has been some feedback and also feedback from myself. Try and keep the episodes a little bit shorter. I know the hour and a half can be a little long, especially if you have to pause it and go back or whatever. When you're whatever it is you're doing, when you're listening to podcasts and things like that. Can be hard for me to stop sometimes, but I'm going to do my best to try to keep it shorter. Also, it doesn't help that my internet sucks and this stuff uploads in real time, so kind of a pain. But that said, I want to talk about, I'm going to bash missionaries a little bit more, and then I want to talk about the problem of human uniqueness, particularly as it relates to tools and technology. So first up, let's talk about missionaries. As I've mentioned on past podcasts, I'm currently working on a book called Of Gods and Country, The Domestication of Our World, which is about the origin of religion, nationalism, and patriarchy, and juxtaposed against the reality of missionaries and conquest, contact, colonization, particularly missionaries as an agent of colonization. Yank and I have both realized that neither of us had actually ever read Bartolome de las Casas, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. Obviously, it's a book I've been very familiar with. I'd had around, read pieces of and everything like that. I just hadn't sat down and read the whole thing. I've probably read more books about it than it over the past 25 years or so. But it's a quick read. It's about 130 pages. And if you exist in this world, I can't recommend it enough, because for all the problems that might exist with Las Casas, and there are many, the account firsthand of colonizing of the New World is fucking batshit crazy. And you think about it, and you're reading things like this, and of course, it's a big question that always arises when I think about a book that is one of my favorites. Is Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History. It's a great piece of ethno-history and really trying to understand the world at 1400, when the West dumped its rotting corpse into the oceans and spread across the southern hemisphere and to what is now, or was then, the New World, now is the Americas. Of course, parallels in Australia and South Pacific Islands, all the places that unfortunately civilization got to. And it's really insane. It's hard to imagine how these people did the things that they did and were able to do the things they were doing. But there's a constant frontier mentality and a constant frontier situation, and it's grotesque. And if you're familiar with Conrad Kurtz talking about Hearts of Darkness, or of course watching Apocalypse Now, you could see why. The book that it's based off of, Hearts of Darkness, from Joseph Conrad, was written in the late 1800s based off his experiences going into the Congo. The movie Apocalypse Now was based off of taking essentially the same story and updating it. America's going into Vietnam and kind of along the furthest expanses of military expansion into the region, kind of effectively the frontier, but creating a no man's land where just nothing short of bloodthirsty killers were able to create these kingdoms. And you see this throughout history, particularly as the technology increases, you get this role really expanding in insane ways. And I'm sure by all means in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, any places where we're sending people, or that this world and its militaries are sending people, there's going to be these situations where there's this kind of chaos unfolding that's just completely marred in religious and nationalistic ideology, where everything is justified and anything goes. And there's precedent for all this. The only really obvious difference is that when you're talking about colonizers in 1400 or something like that, is, the communication was significantly less than it is now. Obviously, soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan can text, post online, things like that. So that's the element of control. And if you just remove that element, then these, fucking assholes were able to just kind of feed off each other and create even more insane situations. Las Casas' book is necessary in the regard that it just lays it out. I mean, these are brutal accounts of murder that constantly were taking place. It was basically like having that lack of check, having that distance made it possible for every one of these fuckers to just be an enabled serial killer, which is insane. But it's definitely worth reading. But there's kind of a question that I was left with here at the end for Las Casas, who is very dead at this point, who ends the book by saying that he presents this because, he never lost faith in any regards in God and in the sacred authority of power in the king and Spanish crown and things like that. So he ends the book by saying, and this is a very powerful book, it's huge impacts, obviously, but that he hoped that these accounts would show the dishonor on the name of God and on that of the king. It's the last words of the book. But, obviously that didn't really happen. So a quick quote from the book. The reader may ask himself if this is not cruelty and injustice of a kind so terrible that it beggars the imagination, and whether these poor people would not fare far better if they were entrusted in the hands of hell than that in the hands of devil in the New World who masquerade as Christians. I think we know where I stand on that one. Of course, if you don't believe in the devil, if you don't believe in Satan, then yeah, they were doing just fine. And far better off, the people of the New World were far better off without God and without Christianity imposing itself, and certainly without swords. So another quote here. There's one other factor which merits a mention, and it is that, from the very outset, the Spanish have taken no more trouble to preach the Christian faith to these peoples than if they had been dealing with dogs or other animals. Indeed, they have done their level best to prevent missionaries from preaching, presumably because they felt that the spread of the gospel would in some way stand between them and the gold and wealth they craved. Today, the people of the New World are as ignorant of God as they were 100 years ago. They have no idea or whether he is made of wood or air, of earth. The only place where the missionaries have enjoyed a modicum of success is New Spain, but we are talking here of a very small corner of the New World, and, for the most part, the local people have died and still die in the blackest ignorance of the faith and without the benefit of the sacraments. So, that touches on my big problem with liberal Christians, and so-called, or whatever they want to believe themselves to be, humanitarian Christians. The idea that they think they can own it, and you see this without all civilization, without all, especially with liberals, and trying to think that, well, we meant well and that's good enough. It's not. And also, this comes back to the central kind of question. Is religion being misapplied, or the teachings of Jesus being misapplied by somebody carrying a sword instead of a Bible? insofar as you can distinguish them. And there's just no reason for me or anybody, especially the indigenous people who are being killed and subjugated, to all of this, that Las Casas had more of a moral standing to claim what was Christianity, what was a Christian mission, than the missionaries that were just butchering, absolutely butchering, raping, killing, enslaving Native women, children, men, everybody. I mean, what they did was by all means unthinkable. But, you know, why should Las Casas say that, you know, this isn't what God wanted? Of course, again, bigger questions there as far as, you know, thinking these are people, we're just killing them, we're not saving them, which is, again, another side of colonization, another huge issue. And these people were no less going to be subjected to ethnocide had he gotten his relatively what he would consider a peaceful missionary purpose. And he never questioned the validity of the crown. He never questioned the right of the kings to subjugate these people, and he just questioned the harshness of it. And I mean, you know, huge issues there for a lot of reasons. But why would you think that what he was saying and what his intents were, and many missionaries that would follow him that come along the same categories, which, as we'll get to in a second here, is a prevalent and continual issue, it baffles me. And it baffles me that religion gets such a free pass in the society, and people, even in the anarchist world, are so willing to give the benefit of the doubt to Christians and think that they mean well, which I just don't believe. And I'm not saying that I haven't met Christians, and there's even been Christian anarcho primitivists, and somebody like Andy Lewis I get along with, I like, but I don't understand it. I don't understand where the free pass for religion comes in, and where people want to take this energy to try and take a fucking book that was written 2,000 years ago, or however long we got to go back to the Old Testament, and say it's like, well, you know, at least we got this part right, when the entire history of that book is just fanfare by patriarchs and just a shitty collection of fan fiction for a God that ultimately decimated in the entire world. So coming back on that, there's a great book, Norman Lewis's The Missionaries, God Against the Indians. So Las Casas' book was written in, I believe, 1542. Could be wrong about that. He was involved in some of the first trips from Spain to the New World. He was, you know, it sounds like he had actually made his wealth in the first place as one of the colonizers before kind of seeing the errors of his way, becoming a priest, and coming back as a missionary, or as a agent of God, whatever you want to call it. And for Norman Lewis, his experiences with missionaries are in, you know, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. This book was was put out in 1988. A lot of the stuff that's in it goes back to like the 50s and 60s. It was a central part of Survival International coming about. And so it's, you know, there's a lot of things I could say about it as a book or anything like that, but in terms of the content, you see that liberal side that Las Casas would want to say that he was a part of, that would be somehow better. But, you know, hundreds of years later, these things didn't really change. The degree and the severity changed a bit, but not by much. Most of the missionaries were involved with agents of oil companies, with miners and loggers, and just expansionists. And they're talking about flybys with planes and dropping explosives. They would drop down gifts to try and get uncontacted tribes to get accustomed to them and get used to their presence. And then they drop down gifts all tied to bombs, and they just kill them. I mean, this stuff did not change. The spread of disease did not change. It just got faster with more technology, and then a much nicer veneer put on it because people could lie. So the particular case I want to read about here is the Panera of Venezuela. And so the New Tribes Mission were there, and there's an account here talking about an anthropologist talking about what they were doing and their strategy. This is a quote from her. Indians like to do everything together. They share everything, particularly their food. They're close to each other. The missionaries understood this, so they worked out the best way to punish those who didn't want to be converted was by isolation. As soon as they had a strong following in the village, they would order the converts to have nothing more to do with those who held out. No one, not even their own parents, was allowed to talk to them, and they were obliged to eat apart from the rest. It was the worst punishment an Indian could imagine, and it often worked. So there's a lot of force being used in these cases. In this particular case, the reasons behind it weren't too shocking, as usually the case. New tribes missions or missionaries are given permission or given access or land holdings by governments or on behalf of multinational corporations, and they're entirely sent in there to pacify a region so they can move in. In this case, the strategic minerals that were in the land that the Panera dare live on were cobalt and uranium. And Westinghouse, General Dynamics were involved in helping to secure and advance the missionaries as an agent. And they just, continually would work to undermine everything about these societies by force and make it look like it was a choice, or make it look like they were coming to some kind of conversion out of choice, when in reality it was just a last resort. Another kind of quote here from the book: when you forbid the Indian to dance, drink his yaraki, and eat the ashes of his dead one, you destroy his culture. One doesn't spread God's message by terror. The one difference that changed between Las Casas time and here, of course, and obviously not in full. We get back to the quote. The New Tribes mission relies on force, and if the native allows himself to be converted, he does so out of conviction, not out of conviction, but fear. Sorry, I kind of butchered that a little. And then Maria Eugenia Villon, this quote is saying the creation of fear was the most powerful weapon in the missionary armory, which is definitely true. So the way a lot of these New Tribes missions and Summer Institute of Linguistics, Wycliffe Bible translators worked was by trying to translate the Bible and then hoping that the Bible would, in their words, would claim or would change the society. Reality of it is that when you set up the situation where missionaries are there and they're trying to create the language, or to turn a language or an oral language into a written language, it requires a lot of changing in terms of how that culture sees the world and how they see each other, because the concepts within the Bible just don't make any sense. So they have to try and translate things so that cultures that don't exist or don't have history as we would say it, or as a literate culture would have it, where they don't have calendars and they don't have things like that, how they would see the world, and trying to insert some level of oral tradition into the Bible and the way it works. So you get a little glimpse of how that works, and looking at this translation for the Panera Bible given by New Tribes Mission, and this is a little quote from it. The Panera killed Jesus Christ because they were wicked. Let's kill Jesus Christ, said the Panera. The Panera seized Jesus Christ. The Panera killed in this way. They laid a cross on the ground. They fastened his hands and his feet against the wooden beams with nails. They raised him straight up, nailed. The man died like that, nailed. Thus the Panera killed Jesus Christ. And you get this kind of repetition. This is a common thing in oral narration, in civilized societies and societies without civilization, or societies against civilization. But this is the way they manipulated things, by trying to take these abstract concepts that had no meaning within grounded peoples living, in this case, in Venezuela, living in the Amazon, for what, these nomadic warriors of the desert would have experienced 2,000 years ago and thousands of miles away. So you get the repetition, you get this sense that the Panera were personally responsible, and that's why they should feel guilt, when are all just horribly foreign concepts. But you try and impose this guilt while at the same time actively taking efforts to tear apart their societies, to destroy their cultures, and make them feel guilty for something that they had previously or very recently had zero relation to or very no understanding. And these people are, and the missionaries are really, kind of a backbiting bunch. They want to put all this effort on it and everything, but it really comes down to, how many souls can we save? It's not this pious kind of shit that they want to pretend it is. And to give it a little example of that, another quote in the book, in Kayarka, 6 evangelical temples fought each other over the conquest and division of souls. So bitter had the struggle become while we were there that one sect broadcast deafeningly amplified pop music, including old Beatles tapes, for no other purpose than to drown the calls to salvation of its nearest rival. And you get this throughout the history of missionaries and conquest and past, present, future, I'm sure, where it really is just kind of a competition to say, it's like, this is our capital, this is our value, this is our asset. How many souls can we save, or how many souls can we claim to save? And the funny thing about that is that if you want to talk about saving souls, all you have to care about is the souls. If the people die in the process, as is often the case, many times the case, anytime you're taking nomadic or semi-nomadic people and you're bringing them to a settlement where there's all the presence of civilization, all the technology, all the tools, all the access to it, and of course all the diseases and all the food that just is garbage, and of course all the sugar, tobacco, alcohol, drugs, prostitution, that's what's going to end up happening. And of course what ends up happening is when people get to these settlements, they're closer to roads, they have access to these small airstrips. There's a lot of alcoholism, there's a lot of addiction, there's a lineage of people having had been sold into slavery and working for plantations. Often the goal of these missions is this kind of velvet glove version of colonialism, where they're going to forcibly break people, forcibly relocate them, and then use missionary foods as subsidiaries to get them dependent on it and get them pulled away by force from hunter-gatherer, horticultural, or even agrarian methods of subsistence, and make them become dependent. And then they take it away, and then they're just saying that your value comes as labor. Of course, a lot of this stuff really just comes down to a company town situation, and then also just straight up slavery, which is a big part of this history. And to give a little more about where they're coming from and where that missionary shit comes from, there's a Brown Gold, which was a magazine, I believe, of New Tribes Missions. It might have been Summer Institute of Linguistics, and here's a quote from that on the subject of unreached Indians. It is fair to say that they sit in darkness. While we cook on fancy stoves, they cook over open fires. While we ride in cars, they have never owned a pair of shoes. While we sleep on nice mattresses, many of them sleep on split bamboo floors. While we struggle to keep our computers going, they are still rubbing sticks together to make a fire. While we perform heart surgery, some of them have never seen a Band-Aid. I'd say that God is right when he says that they sit in darkness. So I'm not a fan of missionaries, not a fan of the Bible, not a fan of any of that. Should be fairly obvious. And if it's not, there you have it. There's my controversial statement. Fuck God, fuck the state, fuck religion, fuck missionaries. And if the sitting in darkness means not having to sit here in computers and trying to talk to people over the world to find some semblance of community while other people sleep on the ground and rub sticks together, make a fire, and have an active community, and have societies where they're not having to perform heart surgeries and deal with heart disease as one of the top killers solely because we eat shit food and we live shitty sedentary lives. Was it worth it? No. And the active forcing of civilization upon these peoples is horrific and ongoing, and it is something that needs a lot more attention drawn to it. So, there's that. It's something that needs a lot more attention, I think, and hoping to give it some. And I'll have more of that as this book comes along, and of course, it's going to be a recurring theme on this podcast. So switch gears a little bit here, but really kind of tying all this stuff back together. is one of my favorite topics, which is the myth of human uniqueness. And the ideas of religion are obviously not untied to this. This is really what a lot of this comes down to, is we have to create reasons to justify what it is we're doing to the world, and things that we couldn't do to the land base or to the earth, the wildness, nature, whatever you want to refer to it as, without having this kind of cognitive dissonance about our relationship to it and our relationship to the world, our relationship to each other. And domestication underlies all that, and religion is nothing if not the one of the greatest forms of domestication. And it's important to understand domestication in this kind of a sense, and to understand the problems of civilization and the ways that we deal with it, and the kind of ideological constructs we have to continually create and perpetuate, just so we can realize that domestication is a process. Domestication is something ongoing, and it's a way that we're kind of told to see the world, and it is sold back to us. But these are constructs, they're ideas, they're things that we can show demonstrably are not true, if only we are giving ourselves the kind of context and the ability to think outside of the boxes that we've been given, or the boxes we've been sold, and the ways that we arbitrarily divide the world into species, or to all these different kind of categories, and give ourselves the place that we can continually see ourselves as better. So there's an ongoing discussion, and that's been going on in Black and Green Review, and really throughout the entirety of anarcho-primitivism, about the nature of symbolic thought and symbolic culture. And there's a lot to it. Number 2 of Black and Green Review, I think, had a lot to offer, hopefully, in that regard, in that discussion of some differing views. It's one thing where John Zerzan and myself see things a little bit differently, in his line of questioning going back to the 70s about the nature of language, which has a long kind of philosophical and historical tradition of, I think ultimately kind of comes back to that question of human uniqueness, and the idea that language, or as Chomsky would say, as grammar, language defined by grammar, makes it something unique that humans have, and therefore in some way superior. And all this stuff kind of goes back to the ideas about the human brain being an anomaly within the natural world, and something capable of a higher plane of thinking, a higher plane of existence, and a lot of really dated notions as far as correlating brain size in humans and changes in human activity. Ideas about certain brain size making it possible for us to organize in a certain way that made collective hunting easier, and made it possible for us to, even in some cases, say that we switch to eating large game, which is really at this point such a moot point and such a non-reality, especially when you look back at the fact that we've been hunters for a very long time, or at very least we've been scavengers for a very long time, and it's kind of an argument I'd gotten in one point with Kirkpatrick Sale, when he wrote one of his more recent books. What's it called? Something about the Ice Age. I'm blanking. Oh well, deal with it. And he had tried to make this argument, which is not an uncommon argument, that the changes about 75,000 years ago or so with brain size, supposed correlation with brain size and group hunting, changed our relationship with the world, because it made it possible for us to hunt big game. And if anybody's hunted or butchered roadkill or something like that, you can kind of get the sense as well that if we're scavengers, and of course that there's ridiculous amount of evidence that we've been hunting for a much longer time than 75,000 years, and possibly upwards of millions of years, at the very least been hunting smaller game and trapping smaller game for millions of years, and scavenging that entire time. The idea that there's some kind of psychological change that occurs between scavenging a large animal and hunting a large animal, or scavenging or hunting a small animal and then hunting a large animal, is really just an extrapolation of kind of ideas that we've built up on, and nothing else. The archaeology, the history behind all that stuff has been thoroughly debunked. So it kind of comes back to it, but there's more to be said about instead of trying to find these points that made us supposedly so different, and treating that as its own trajectory to find the points where we have been the same. And for me, part of that goes back to language, and it goes back to communication. And a lot of the things that ideas we have about grammar, the ideas we have about the importance of language and object impermanence and things like that. I mean, they're very demonstrably untrue to say that there's something that's uniquely human, and tools being another point. But the tools and technology are the point I want to get to here in a second. But as a kind of roundabout way, there's this section I want to read just because it's, I think, very powerful and very important on the matter of, what aren't we seeing? What have we missed because we've been so obsessed with this idea of human uniqueness, and we're just not understanding other animals on their own terms, and we're spending too much time trying to say it's like, well, why we're so important. So this is from Carl Safina's Beyond Words, which is an excellent book. Highly recommend it. I'm very much hoping that we can get Carl interviewed in Black and Green Review. This book's from 2015, and then in 2016 or early 2017, I think it's 2016, it's View from the Lazy Point came out, and that book is also very excellent. But this section is with Beyond Words. He's talking about the subtitle of the book is What Animals Think and Feel, and really a great book in terms of undermining that argument about human uniqueness. And it has a lot of like really great stuff that's far beyond anecdotal about how different animals communicate. And so this section is talking about, this is the end of the section talking about elephants. The chapter is called Holding Back, Letting Go. I'm just going to read it because I think this part is really, really telling and showing that communication, language, things like that, we just have to stop thinking about them in terms of what we've upheld for humans. This, Vicky says enthusiastically, is what I mean by a cohesive family. Having finished eating, the elephants gather closely, adults facing out, children in the middle. Jean is very slow, backing into Jolene, touching her. Quote, see them all standing together now, leaning against each other, touching with tails, trunks. This is perfect. Everyone's feeling really safe. They'll probably have a snooze now, end quote. Babies sprawl around abundantly, dozing peacefully within their tribe's safekeeping. The adults just stand quietly, at least it seems. All that ear flapping, says Vicky. That means they're talking. We can't hear them. Lyle Watson describes finding himself in an extraordinarily poignant encounter with the cliffs of South Africa's seacoast while he was watching a whale. And this is all a pretty lengthy quote here. The sensation I was feeling on the clifftop was a sort of reverberation in the air itself. The whale had submerged, and I was feeling something. The strange rhythm seemed now to be coming from behind me, from the land, so I turned to look across the gorge, where my heart stopped. Standing there in the shade of the tree was an elephant, staring out to sea. A female with a left tusk broken off near the base. I knew who she was, who she had to be. I recognized her from a color photograph put out by the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry under the title Last Remaining Kenyan Elephant. This was the matriarch herself. She was here because she no longer had anyone to talk to in the forest. She was standing here on the edge of the ocean because it was the next to nearest and most powerful source of infrasound. The under rumble of the surf would have been well within her range, a soothing balm for an animal used to being surrounded by low and comforting frequencies, by the life sounds of a herd, and now this was her next best thing. My heart went out to her. The whole idea of this grandmother of many being alone for the first time in her life was tragic, conjuring up the visions of countless other old and lonely souls. But just as I was about to be consumed by helpless sorrow, something even more extraordinary took place. The throbbing was back in the air. I could feel it, and I began to understand why. The blue whale was on the surface again, pointed inshore, resting, her blowhole clearly visible. The matriarch was here for the whale. The largest animal in the ocean and the largest living land animal were no more than 100 yards apart, and I was convinced that they were communicating. In infrasound, in concert, sharing big brains and long lives, understanding the pain of high investment in the few precious offspring, aware of the importance and the pleasure of complex sociality, these rare and lovely great ladies were commiserating over the back fence of this rocky Cape shore, woman to woman, matriarch to matriarch, almost the last of their kind. I churned, blinking away the tears, and left them to it. This was no place for a mere man. Of course, I think that's powerful on a number of levels, and I just, it's took me back when I read it, as much of this book does. But these are things that we're discovering in the aftermath and in the wake of what civilization has taught us, what religion has allowed us to believe, and what domestication constantly reinforces about the idea that we can do the things we're doing to the world. We can have discussions about the consequences of it. We could have discussions about the extents to which other animals communicate, or which they have language or not, as long as we're having this backdrop of civilized existence where we are just obliterating all of these animals and obliterating the world and obliterating everything that goes on in life. And it's insane, and it just has to fucking stop. It's going to eventually stop on its own, and probably in the relatively near future. But the sooner we start to feel these things, the sooner we start to undermine everything about our ideas of being unique and our ideas of being this special godsend, and the idea of thinking that going along with this and just having these conversations and having these ideas is enough. It doesn't do it. It's not enough. We have to do something about this. The sooner, the more that this comes down, the more agency we have in taking this on, the better off we'll all be. So I'll end up talking a little bit more about that in terms of rewilding and in terms of understanding and undermining that in our own lives and our own experiences. But I want to get back to the discussion of tools and technology. So there's plenty of discussion that shows that there's nothing about tool use that's innately human. It's something that plenty of animals do, and something that many animals use, much like language, much like communication. And we give ourselves credit because we want to think of ourselves as ingenious. We want to give ourselves credit as a species for the things that our societies have created. In reality, when we're using technology, I'm talking to a microphone that's connected to an audio input that goes to a computer, and it's going to the internet. We can feel like, oh, hey, we've got this thing. We've got this level of superiority. We've created this. As a society, we're doing all these things. There's not a single person in this world that could put all these things together. Nobody's going to create a cell phone. Nobody's going to create a cell phone tower on their own. Nobody's going to create all these different interfaces, and people can put things together, but nobody's going into the mines to get all the parts that go into it. Nobody's getting all the rare earth minerals on their own. It's kind of an insane situation where we can give ourselves the space to take credit as a culture for all these things without taking the blame for what it takes to get it to us. And that's where I want to go back to in terms of talking about tools and technology, and talking about what that means for our own identity, our own sense of individuality, and our sense of pride in being this supposedly unique animal, because we have access to these things, because we carry a cell phone in our pocket, which is a crazy technology. I mean, it's totally insane. It shouldn't have ever existed. The consequences of it are things that none of us will really ever see, and definitely not in full. And if you spend your life trying to understand what went into a cell phone alone, or what goes into a computer alone, or what it takes for the internet to even be reaching you and these words to be getting to you, we're not going to see all of it. We're just not going to, and it requires this kind of distancing. So to start off with definitions, I think in terms of technology versus tool, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people do things differently. A lot of people say things differently. And then, of course, talking about what I would call a tool could refer to any number of things covered by a group of experimental archaeologists / rewilding people who run a journal called or Bulletin for the Society of Primitive Technology, or Bulletin of Primitive Technology. So the language there is obviously not universal, and I think it's important to be a bit more nuanced about it. But there's limitations to all of it, so I'm just going to do my best in trying to articulate what it is I'm getting at. And there's a long tradition on all sides in terms of that. But as far as a tool goes, Carl Safina has a definition that I think is very simple and very useful, and it helps explain, or gives a context for it not being something totally unique to humans. A tool is a thing that isn't a part of your body that you use to accomplish a goal. Pretty straightforward. And it's easier to kind of define that against what technology is. And so I often go to Lewis Mumford, particularly The Myth of the Machine, Technics and Human Development, the first part of the two books there. This book's from 1966, and he's got a pretty extensive quote. The whole idea is building out techniques and what he would call the mega machine. So delineating between tools and technology. And just to start out here, he goes a long way in terms of showing the over importance we tend to play in feeling this sense of empowerment because of technology. So I'll read a little bit of a quote here from it. Now, we cannot understand the role that technics has played in human development without a deeper insight into the historic nature of man. Yet that insight has been blurred during the last century because it has been conditioned by a social environment in which a mass of new mechanical inventions has suddenly proliferated, sweeping away ancient processes and institutions and altering the traditional conception of both human limitations and technical possibilities. Our predecessors mistakenly coupled their particular mode of mechanical progress with an unjustifiable sense of increasing moral superiority. But our own contemporaries, who have reason to reject this smug Victorian belief in the inevitable improvement of all human institutions through the command of the machine, nevertheless concentrate with manic fervor upon the continued expansion of science and technology, as if they alone magically would provide the only means of human salvation. Since our present overcommitment to techniques is in part due to a radical misinterpretation of the whole course of human development, the first step towards recovering our balance is to bring under review the main stages of man's emergence from its primal beginnings onward. Just because man's need for tools is so obvious, we must guard ourselves against overstressing the role of stone tools hundreds of thousands of years before they became functionally differentiated and efficient. In treating toolmaking as essential to early man's survival, biologists and anthropologists for long underplayed or neglected a mass of activities in which many other species were for long more knowledgeable than man. Despite the contrary evidence put forward by R.U. Stacey, Darrell Ford, and Andre Leroy-Gourhan, there is a tendency to identify tools and machines with technology, as to substitute the parts for the whole. Even in describing only the material components of technics, this practice overlooks the equally vital role of containers, first hearths, pits, traps, cordage, later baskets, bins, byres, houses, to say nothing of the still later collective containers like reservoirs, canals, and cities. The static components play an important part in every technology, not least in our own day, with its high-tension transformers and its giant chemical retorts, its atomic reactors. In any adequate definition of technics, it should be plain that the many insects, birds, and mammals had made far more radical innovations in the fabrication of containers with their intricate nests and bowers, their geometric beehives, the urbanoid anthills and terminates, the beaver lodges, and the man's ancestors had achieved in the making of tools until the emergence of Homo sapiens. In short, if technical proficiency alone were sufficient to identify and foster intelligence, man was for a long laggard compared with many other species. The consequences of this perception should be plain, namely that there was nothing uniquely human in toolmaking until it was modified by linguistic symbols, aesthetic designs, and socially transmitted knowledge. Now here's a little bit of a point of departure between Mumford and I, again, this book was written in 1968. A lot of things changed, or in 1966, and a lot of things changed, especially in 1968, when you put out, or the Anthropological World put out Man the Hunter, and started to revise a lot of ideas we had about what being a hunter-gatherer meant, what being a nomad meant, and the consequences of it. So Mumford becomes concerned primarily with techniques and technology as an idea and as a social change. And while he gets a lot of really important points in terms of the nature of surplus, the nature of production, the nature of sedentary societies, I still think there's a bit that if he had been alive longer, been writing, which he did live longer, but I mean, like, had written this book in particular, after a lot of those kind of conversations have been coming out, he probably wouldn't have been as sour on the materialist interpretations of where technology comes from, which effectively means that technology is a reflection of how we change the society. So if you remove the idea of hunter-gatherers going from immediate return, which means that you just go out and you get what you need as you need it, versus hunter-collectors or horticulturalists as a delayed return society, which means that you're essentially investing in the future. You're producing a surplus. You're producing something that's going to eventually pay off. Essentially, what progress would become in kind of comedically abstract ways. I think it would be different. So it's kind of a side point, but I think it's nonetheless a very important one. And regardless of that, his idea of technology begins with the organization of labor. And he's got this kind of quote a number of times, a number of ways, but I love it. The very outset of the organization of archetypical machine composed of human parts. So in that regard, he's not really far off from any kind of materialist analysis and talking about the origins of surplus, the origins of production, which are things that are very historically unique and very much different. But the idea basically being is that technology or technological society are separated from tools at the point at which they become for surplus production or for something for later use than what we're currently using. And it is social in nature. Technology isn't just about creating a stone tool or being able to have the knowledge of how to make a bow and arrow or something like that. It just comes down to playing a part within the chain of command or the layers of a society where you're just adding to the division of labor and adding to the creation of society as though it's something separate from yourself, as we've all become horribly aware and familiar. So in that regard, the distinction between a tool and technology becomes particularly important because a technology becomes the basis of society in and of itself, kind of the defining factor of it, the way that we identify ourselves and the way we can take a certain pride in having some part in this much larger thing without ever actually contributing to anything, without ever actually having to confront the fact that we have very little, if any, knowledge or ability to subsist on our own or to subsist as a culture within this apparatus. So the tool, in the sense of what a hunter-gatherer might use or what even a horticulturalist might use, is really the encapsulation of just knowledge and ability. And a tool is something that could be created and handed off or just used and ditched, and it just doesn't require an entire industry. There's no mining for iron or if you're making stone tools. And there's really a lot about tools and tool use amongst hunter-gatherer societies and horticultural societies that had a vast amount of variation. In fact, no technology or no tool in the history of humanity was as fast or as universally applied as the cell phone was in the past 15 to 20 years, where at this point, I think it's half the adult population of the entire world has a cell phone. Even the way that fire was taken on by hunter-gatherers, going back hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years, it wasn't even as universal as the cell phone has been. And it certainly wasn't as quick and as widespread. And the ways that we typify, what a hunter-gatherer might use as a tool in terms of bows and arrows, plenty of hunter-gatherers throughout the world that don't use them, and they don't necessarily make sense. But the idea of a tool isn't the defining trait of a hunter-gatherer. It's not the identifying trait of an indigenous person. And within the rewilding movement, within the primitive skills and primitive, technology and skilling world, there's this kind of tendency to want to identify with those tools as a rejection in certain ways of this technology and a realization that we have no connection with the machines that our lives are encompassing, that every aspect of our lives are involving, and from phones to cars to, even a hammer that's mass produced or an axe that's mass produced and steel tools and things like that. But there's still this kind of idea that we can identify on this material level and really kind of just build up this knowledge and replace our toolkits with tools that we've made and get it and really kind of move on. But even beyond that, kind of going beyond just the survivalist ideas and the ideas of being very technologically dependent, I think it's important to understand not just the difference between a tool, something that you can pick up and use, and I can go down to the creek bed down here and I can grab some flint, I can grab some river stones, I can craft a simple cutting tool and use that for foraging for the day, dole it out, use it to skin and butcher an animal. And you can even use the riverstone rock to hunt, and distinguish that from technology, which is this entire social thing. It's something that requires this entire change of production and really becomes a central part of the identity of a given culture. And it has to. It's by necessity that it must, because that's how we stop looking around. It's how we stop identifying with the world around us, as we see ourselves as separate from it. We see ourselves as unique. We can embody the traits of all these individual technologies and all these mass-produced tools, and kind of get this sense of completeness that keeps us from really understanding how much we're removed ourselves and how much we've lost in the process. So going back to Safina, I think he does a good job pointing that out as well. And I'll go back to quoting him here from Beyond Words again. But as individuals, most of us, given bolts of cloth wrapped in a bow, couldn't even sew a decent shirt. Yet we enjoy congratulating ourselves for collective human achievements in which we individually deserve no credit, achievements most of us don't comprehend. Humanity's collective horrors we generally don't like to claim credit for. In the 20th century, civilized people killed over 100 million other civilized people, and this century hasn't gotten off to a great start. We'd rather focus on our ability to make planes and computers, a soothing delusion to those of us who don't actually know how to make planes and computers, which may be just as well. Dogs don't know that people make cars, about what it actually takes to put together a car, the mining, the metallurgy, the chemistry, the design and assembly, the factory origin and distribution. Dogs know slightly less than most of us, who just hop in and go for the ride. So end of that quote. And so, I think that's an important point for perspective, and that's something that we need to be keeping in mind, especially as we're talking about rewilding and resisting domestication. So that's also a subject. I have an essay in mind in the new issue of Black and Green Review called Fair Revisions. So I'm just going to close out reading a little bit of that. It's from the section From Observation to Integration. The world is a fairly forgiving place. Unlike the technosphere we have isolated ourselves in, there aren't nearly as many circumstances presented in the wild that are likely to prove themselves fatal. And people do die in the wild from falling out of trees, yet, much like the incredibly low rates of being preyed upon by other predators, this is an exceptionally low probability. But the chances of dying in civilization from car accidents, drug overdose, fatal medical errors, preventable diet-related illness, suicide, homicide, or any of the illnesses that come along with industrial pollution and proximity with domesticated animals are perpetually creeping up. What we give up in this is in exchange for the illusion of control. We accept the possibility of being killed, wounded, or debilitated by cars, yet we believe we choose our role in the unspoken social contract just by being in or around them. As G.A. Bradshaw reminds us, we are capable of understanding carnivores or other potential predators if we just give them the benefit of the doubt and learn to understand them as a species and as individuals. That's largely not true for technology. Things go wrong constantly, and our degree of control is largely negligible. Technology gives us the weaponry to create unforeseen and often unpredicted consequences for our actions. It feeds our disconnect that washes our hands of responsibility for what we do and our own complicity within civilization. In the wild, removed of such distractions, that physical and psychological barrier is suffocated in what can often feel like an air of vulnerability. When we outfit ourselves with gadgetry and artifacts of mass production, we're giving ourselves a survivalist lifeline to civilization. If you can move past them, then you can laugh at some of the growing pains along the way. But rest assured, we've had so many layers of domesticated vision put upon us that as this journey isn't likely to end in our own lifetimes. As the nomadic hunter-gatherers would remind us, if we simply paid attention, laughing at yourself is a pretty vital skill, potentially even more important than the ability to recreate an impressive collection of primitive tools. Replacing our obsession of consumable material goods with wild-crafted ones might improve your skills without ever checking your survivalist habits at the door. The path of wildness requires shutting up and allowing yourself to be shut up. Sometimes you just have to stop and listen, pay attention to the alarms, the calls, the signs, and the behaviors. That's especially true when you are the source of them, the connections that become apparent beyond thought. The process of peeling back begins, one stupid preconceived notion at a time, unraveling our lifelines to the iron lung. Observation is a vital step, but observation alone doesn't take us away from our status and our stasis as spectators of life rather than actors within it. Rewilding is about moving beyond observation into integration. The backpacker and birdwatcher are intent to leaving only footprints. Rewilding is about leaving yourself behind, to learn to understand the larger wild context so that we may become a part of it. And it goes on from there. But the central idea here all revolves around the idea that, the way that we see the world, the way that our perception of the world is shaped is at this point very intentional, which is something that is historically unique. Never in human history really has there been such an ability to craft narratives and to shift those narratives in such a way and to reinforce them in the way that technology currently is, to keep us from paying attention to what's actually going on and to pay attention to what's happening in the world and to buy into religion and kind of personify it and to buy into the religion of technology and of the lives that we're able to present within social media and social networks and things like that. So it's becoming more important the more technology makes it possible for us to really isolate ourselves and to identify with it, that we look beyond that and we understand, that this technology is a tool of domesticators. It's a tool of programmers used to distract and used to keep us from seeing these things and to see ourselves as unique and important and special in every way that's just going to keep us searching for ways to prove that to ourselves into the days that we ultimately die because of that search. And that's taking more and more kind of insane forms. And you see the school shootings, you see the rise of drug epidemics, and you look at a global scale, you're looking at, Bangladeshi women being crushed by buildings for fast fashion, and just the insanity and the world of, a child born in Syria at any point over the last, 6-7 years since the civil war has been going on there and resulting in itself from climate change and resulting itself from food shortages and things like that. I mean, there's just another scale, another level that we have to look at the world at. And it goes beyond everything that we know as nomadic hunter-gatherers, the way that we're shaped and the way that we see things and the way that we're meant to interact within communities rather than on this technologically amplified global scale that they're just basically counterintuitive to how we've always existed. But they become necessary because this is the world that exists. And whether you want to get lost in some philosophical kind of bend about what is real or what isn't, I mean, it doesn't change anything about the fact that we are killing off all the elephants. We are killing off the whales in mass. We are killing mass portions of the world. We're feeding into the genocidal regimes of at the hands of missionaries, miners, loggers, and whatever else, just so we can get these rare earth minerals and oil to keep us going on, to keep us looking for some way to define ourselves and make ourselves feel special. And that's pretty fucked up. And it's not something we should be okay with. It's not something we should think is just all right and that's just going to kind of deal with itself. It has to be confronted. The nature of domestication needs to be confronted. All the myths that support that idea, that support all this, the religion, the nationalism, the philosophies, the ideologies, and just even getting online and playing along with it all, it needs to be radically confronted. And so that's where we're at here. So with that, I'm going to close out here. Again, the newest books that we got out, Gathered Remains is out now. Black and Green Review number 5 just came out. Freddie Perlman's Anything Can Happen is a new one too. If you're interested, of course, the whole point of this stuff is to drive towards the books and have this actual conversation with thought instead of just people posting and reposting something and liking a headline or whatever the fuck it is that happens on social media and social networks. If you like what we do, you support it. Get the books, read them, discuss them, talk about them in real life. Let's have conversations in real life. If you have info shop or go to university, you can help get speakers out. Myself and other editors of Black and Green Review are available for workshops, talks, anything like that. You can reach out and also let me know if you got any comments, things you want me to discuss. blackandgreenpress@gmail.com. That's blackandgreenpress@gmail.com. If you want to send a letter, still have a P.O. Box. It's Black and Green. P.O. Box 402, Salem, Missouri, 65560. Again, that's P.O. Box 402, Salem, Missouri, 65560. Projects do take a lot of money. We can always use help, donations, support. You can donate via PayPal or Patreon. If you go to blackandgreenreview.org and the Black and Green podcast tab, there's some more information and links there. And also, I'm working on a couple things for future episodes in terms of discussions, interviews, and things like that. If somebody has an extra microphone like an SM58 or something like that they want to donate, it would be greatly appreciated, and it would make all that a lot easier. So I appreciate you listening, and talk to you next time.